We're shifting gears right now to get into our conversation about racial and ethnic disparities in our community economic development plans. So let me see, let me get on the right page on my video here. So we have three panels, distinguished panels again, I might add. So the first, thank you, Dr. Harris. Appreciate your coming. The first panel is Chris Liu, who is the director of the Washington State Department of Enterprise Services, Frank Lemos, president of the Washington Minority Business Advisory Council, and Bob Armstead, who's the president of the National Association of Minority Contractors of Washington. They're going to talk about racial and ethnic disparities that they're seeing within the minority business community. So, Director Liu, thank you so much for sharing your time. I'm sorry I got us so far behind schedule. I hope that didn't upset your daily schedule, but thank you for being with us.
So for the record, good morning, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Chris Liu, Director for the Department of Enterprise Services and also the Chair for the Governor's Sub-Cabinet on Business Diversity. So to start off this morning, I passed out a PowerPoint. I'm sorry I didn't bring an electronic version so the audience could see, but I think I brought some copies. I'm sure not enough for the entire audience. But this is kind of a compressed PowerPoint about where we are with the sub-cabinet, and we're not providing any solutions in this PowerPoint, we're providing data. So to begin with, the governor had this, or formulated this sub-cabinet in June of this year, so just a few short months ago. And some of that or the reasons for that was an exchange of letters and interest from the Washington State Coalition, a Civil Rights Coalition, some of which who are sitting with me by my side here. So some of the folks who are in this coalition, let me kind of tell you, and this is not the entire list, is the Washington State African American Political Action Committee, the National Association of Minority Contractors, better known as NAMAC, the Washington Black Collective, the National Association of Advancement for Colored People, NAACP, most widely known as, El Centro de la Raza, the Seattle chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League, and these are just to name a few, the Organization of the Chinese Americans. So you can see this is a very, very broad coalition of people who have an interest in what we do as a state. And basically in state contracting and how we do state contracting. So the first thing we did is listening to our community and looking at what are the barriers to doing business and the difficult, inconsistent processes that state agencies have and the current performance number. So let me give you this number. Our state population, depending on who you decide to, whose statistics you decide to use, range anywhere from 18 to 21%. State contracting participation or inclusion, as we call it, is 1% or less. So there's an obvious disparity there. So in our current state, which is the next slide, we're trying to articulate some of the things that we're running into. One is the data is not standardized. So everybody here today has been talking about data and the data that they have. Well, the state does not have consistent data. The second thing is there are many independent efforts. So I'm not telling you that nobody isn't trying. I'm telling you everybody is trying. But they're independent focuses. So we need to make sure that we have a centralized focus rather than independent focuses. There's no common language, and I mean this sincerely, is when we talk about diversity or the elements of diversity, everybody has a different terminology and different interpretation of the words that we use to describe diversity. And lastly, there is not a statewide community of practice. So while individual agencies, and we're talking about 160 different agencies, when we start talking about the practices that we execute, we're not sharing any of those practices among the diversity community or the agencies within themselves. So you can imagine 160 agencies doing 160 different things. There's not going to be a concerted effort of how we proceed forward. So if you flip that, when we formulated the subcabinet, we had what we call a scrum team come together. These are subject matter experts from each of the agencies who really know the intimate working of how the agencies actually do the business. So I'm not going to go through all 14 things that we discovered, but this represents all the things in a nutshell. Now, there's a lot of detail that went behind all of these things. So while we're topically talking about these 14 issues, there's many, many more things that were discovered behind this. So you're probably wondering who formulates the subcabinet. And on the very next page, here are the subcabinet. Now, you would imagine that we'd have probably 50 or 60 agencies in the subcabinet. We, in actuality, have 6 major agencies and a number of other agencies. The composition of the subcabinet is very, very important. So let me kind of summarize this for you. This subcabinet was formulated not to make recommendations, and this is a very important distinction. The governor has asked us to solve the problem. So I want to make sure that that we understand the distinction. We're not making recommendations here. We're going after to solve the problem. So when we talk about the three-legged stool here, and you heard part of it, the criminal justice system, now we're talking about jobs, and the other leg of that is what are we going to be doing with education? We're focusing in here now on jobs. So the 5 principal agencies that formulate the cabinet is the Department of Transportation, Department of Social and Health Services, the Healthcare Authority, the Department of Enterprise Services, and the Department of Corrections. And why do we have these 5 agencies? It's because these 5 agencies spend roughly 66% of all the dollars that are non-education dollars within the state. And we're talking about basic education dollars. And then we have added the Department of Labor and Industries. And why did we add them? Is because the Department of Labor and Industries has probably the highest inclusion rate out of all the agencies. They're somewhere around 11 or 12%, while not up to the 18 or 21% that reflects our state population. It certainly is way further than where we are. So they have a community of practice already started in that agency. In addition to that, we also added the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Office of Minority and Women Business Enterprise, the Commission on African American Affairs. Ed Prince is in the audience today. Commission on Asian Pacific Affairs and the Commission on Hispanic Affairs, which we have the director here also in the audience. Why did we add them? Is because we want to provide community transparency and reporting and communications directly back to the communities. We also added one other person, and that was somebody from the Attorney General's office. As you imagine, and as legislators, you know that every agency has an Attorney General assigned to them. And if you ask the Attorney General's office through that agency what the diversity plan is or how do you interpret the laws, if you have 160 different agencies, you're going to get 160 different answers. And so we felt that we needed to have a particular lawyer who was in charge and was going to make the call on diversity within the state. And so the Attorney General provided us a single attorney, which opinions will be rendered on through about disparity and diversity within the state. And that's Laura Watson, who you may recognize the name as our assistant solicitor, state solicitor, and who's now moved on to manage the Department of Ecology in their legal department, but who is the authority on Title VI and disparity and diversity within the state. In addition to that, the governor's office sends a representative, and it's usually the chief of staff or assistant chief of staff, because this is how much attention is being paid to this particular story. So it's high level, it's an action committee, we're not making recommendations, and we're going to have legal status when we go forward and what we're actually doing. So the emphasis has been on action. So on the next slide here is anticipated area of focus. The first 2 items on this are pretty obvious. Contracting and procurement, because this is where the big bulk of the state's money is actually spent. The second thing we're doing is public works, and there's a slash here of transportation practices. we're not looking at washed out federal transportation practices. We're looking at state dollar practices within Department of Transportation. As you know, they're participating in the committee. The items 3 to 7, which is training policy, data collection, diversity architecture, and communications and outreach, are really part of a solution, infrastructure, if you will. Any solution that we bring forward will have to be implemented in this way. So we're concentrating, especially in point number 3, which is training and education, that when we have a solution come forward, we're just not going to say, here's the solution, go implement it. You can't do that. And I think that's something that we've been very reticent in within government and state agencies. And it's not a criticism of the state agencies. Is we have to train our people, because what we're talking about here is really cultural change in how we do business within the state and how the agencies actually execute the policies and that has been set forth by the state legislature and by the office of the governor. We have to train our people. As we all know, our middle managers and staff are going to be around a lot longer than any of the directors ever will. As an executive director, I know my lifespan is less than 4 years. So while I'm here and doing the work of diversity, we know that my staff is going to be 20 years behind me. So we have to make that cultural change. So whatever we implement is going to be sustainable. And the coalition and many of our stakeholders have said, well, it's great that you're doing this thing. We need sustainable change. And so we want to see that change live beyond your tenure as an agency director. So just as an example, we have a couple things that are in the mills right now as far as promoting a better atmosphere for contractors within our state. We have a bill proposal, hasn't been approved by the governor's office, so I want to make sure that perfectly clear that we're not proposing anything at this point until we have clearance to do so. But it talks about some of the things that we can do to help and stimulate the economy and stimulate minority participation in business. As you well know, that many of our minority contractors don't have the means to do bonding and to do insurance and those startup costs. So we want to make sure that we make it a little easier for them. They're mostly all small business with the exception of a few. They all qualify for public works, either in limited public works or in small public works. And so this is to help them get over that initial hump. So I want to make sure I don't overrun my time because I know everybody needs a chance to speak.
Thank you for the overview of the issue. And I didn't commend you enough, I think, in my introduction. I apologize for that because I really have to say that I'm proud of the work that you've done historically as the director of the Office of Minority and Women Business Enterprises. Cleaned that entire agency and got it on track up in a year, and the governor saw so much promise in the work that you had done that he made you the director of the Department of Enterprise Services, which is, I think, the largest department in state government as far as spend goes.
As far as spend, yes.
Yeah, so I'm really glad. I'm sad to hear you say that, you know, your term is less than 4 years and the staff is going to be 20 years behind you. I'm glad the staff will be there if you can get that cultural shift. But thank you for the great work that you've done up to this point.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. So let me see. Who was next? Is Mr. Lemos or? Yeah,
I didn't sit
so.
properly. I just sat first, so I can go next.
Yeah, please.
So Senator Hasagawa, thank you for having me here today. Caucus of Color, thank you for having this event. I think it's important, as you know, and I thank the guests that have already spoken. We have some serious issues and a lot of work to do when it comes to inequity in the future of this country, quite honestly, as the demographics continue to grow. We have a problem. Someone has to pay for Social Security. And if our community isn't working and creating jobs, we have a national problem. So thank you so much. Frank Lemos, Commissioner with his Commission of Hispanic Affairs. My focus is economic development. The Commission has been working diligently in bringing awareness of inequities in public contracting in Washington State. A lot of that is the work that I focus on. I'm also president of the Washington State Minority Business Advisory Council, and I'm also a business, 45 employees, engineering, North King County. I'm federally certified DBE and state certified MBE, and I mention those things for a reason as I go into my topic. I would be remiss to not mention that our second annual Washington State Minority Business Policy Summit / workshop we had in September. I just finalized, so even our guests that were there do not have this document, but I did provide you guys this document. And what it is, this is second year, along with the commissions, ethnic commissions as partners with MBAC, we meet with the community to talk about their issues in doing business in Washington State. A majority of the issues that are brought up are processes that aren't policy, and then my group puts together, what can we derive from those discussions and to a policy platform. I want to thank and recognize Senator Hasegawa and Sharon Tomiko Santos, who helped begin to sponsor a bill last year. It was a little late, that would lift the current ability for municipalities, government municipalities and agencies to lift non-bonding requirements from $35,000, which has been set since 1982 and has not gone up, to $150,000. The community will be pushing for these two bills in this coming short session. One of the largest, and obviously from hearing the discussions earlier, largest issues we have in the minority business community is credit. And you really have to own a home. And that is one of the largest deficits, especially in the African American community. And so bonding, you have to have credit. To have credit, you have to have assets. And while a business is trying to grow, bonding for contractors is a struggle. So this would really help. And it's a small business bill, so it's not focused only on minority and women-owned businesses. It's a small business bill, and it helps everyone. And AGC has joined on to support it. So I want to get into more specifics as we discuss issues. The last 3 years, I've been studying diligently. There are 3 disparity studies that have been done in our state. The Washington State Department of Transportation is required every 3 years to do a disparity study. The reason they're required to do disparity studies is so that they can set mandatory goals. Mandatory goals in public contracting is actually illegal. It violates the Civil Rights Act. So for the DBE program to work, it has to have a disparity study that proves there's disparate impacts and effects upon certain groups based on race and or gender. So we've had that disparity, and it says all the things that in this room everyone knows is that there's inequities. Huge inequities with African American, Native American, and Latino, and some inequities with Asian. And women were found to have twice as much work as statistically they should. That's what the WashDOT disparity proved in 2013. And then Sound Transit and the Port of Seattle joined in and funded, from that study, were able to fund their own study at a discount. And the numbers were exactly the same for every one of the groups. So there are gross disparities in public contracting for minority businesses, a huge issue. So I want to talk about really quickly just solutions. We have what was sold to the citizens and our voters, a civil rights law, Initiative 200, does the opposite. What I-200 did in 1998 was made it illegal to set goals based on gender and race. And in a world of equality and fairness, you would think that that is fair. What it has done is created the largest gap we've ever seen in Washington State in public contracting. So the issue really is I-200. I-200 could stay exactly where it's at, RCW 49.60.400. But what needs to be added to it is a second part of Title VI when it comes to discrimination. There are 2 forms of discrimination: individual discrimination that is based on intent. So someone intended to discriminate you based on your race and color. It's really hard to prove. The second part of discriminatory action, and a lot of even our AGs aren't really aware or experts in this area, is disparate impacts. And disparate impacts have been proven in Washington State. So one of the push that I'm working with the community to push for in this coming year and years to come is a modification to I-200 that would make disparate impacts illegal. And that is really where the problem at. On the national level, I'm working with folks in D.C., the MBDA, the Minority Business Development Agency, under Commerce. I'm working with US DOJ, and we are trying to, in the next, 10 months, trying to put additional teeth in Title VI, because right now there's no fiduciary penalty or criminal action that can be applied when Title VI is violated, which is, of course, everyone's civil rights. So I really do thank you for your time. There's tons of things I can share. I will email some of the information I have here to each one of you. And please, any interest in these issues, please reach out to me. Thank you so much.
I appreciate your being concise, Mr. Lemos. I just want to let the audience know that looks like we're going to be about a half-hour overtime at this point. I will be staying. I know that many of us have meetings that we have to get off to, but I will be here to hear all the testimony, and then hopefully we have a laundry list of public testimony too, which we're going to have to limit the amount of time per person speaking. So, let me see, Bob Armstead.
Yes. Good morning. My name is Bob Armstead. I am president of the National Association of Minority Contractors, Washington State Chapter, and a member of the board of directors of the national organization. Thank you very much, Senator Hasagawa, for inviting me to come this morning and to provide testimony. I will be as short and concise as possible to help you save time. I was requested to provide information related to documents that are available so that the committee or anyone could refer back to those documents as the source of the information. The first document that I will reference is a document prepared by the state of Washington regarding expenditures by the state on an annual basis, broken down by race and gender. For Washington State, the last report that I personally saw showed that 99.5% of the state expenditures were being spent with one group, that 0.5 of 1% of the state expenditures were spread between all ethnic groups, not one, all ethnic groups, 1/2 of 1%. The next document is the Washington State Department of Transportation Disparity Study as of 2012, which, as Mr. Lemos indicated a few moments ago, determined that there were inequities in the expenditure of funding and contracts between certain ethnic groups, that white women exceeded by 200% the amount given their representation in terms of their contractors. That study recommended certain things be done to correct or alleviate that problem. We're in 2015. They have advertised for a consultant to come in to do a new disparity study in 2016, and the recommendations from 2012 have not been implemented. The next document is the Sound Transit Disparity Study. Pretty much same findings. The next is the Port of Seattle Disparity Study. Again, pretty much the same findings. There's a report that the University of Washington prepares quarterly. And this report also reflects their distribution of contracts and contracting dollars. The last report that I personally saw, their percentage of construction contract dollars spent with minorities was 0. Their percent of construction contracting dollars spent with women was 0. It just goes and goes. The next document is one that you're very familiar with. It's the new transportation budget for the state of Washington, we attempted to get provisions put into that bill that would have allowed, if not required, inclusion. We got nothing. All that we got was an opportunity to report 15 minutes to the Joint Transportation Commission. So here is a $16 billion program with no provisions for inclusion of the minority community in the state of Washington. Depending on whose statistics you use, the minority community is anywhere from 18 to 20% of the population of the state. The next is the reports that are submitted by the Washington State Department of Transportation to the Federal Highway Administration. Each year, for each DBE reporting period, disadvantaged business enterprise, the state of Washington, as a condition of being the recipient of federal funding for transportation projects, agrees to have a DBE program. As a part of that requirement, they have to set goals as to what their participation goals are. They have not met those goals that they have put forth to the feds for years. In their last report to the Federal Transit Administration, which was a 4-year report, which is greatly upsetting that they would be allowed to go 4 years without reporting. For 3 of those 4 years, their goal attainment was 0. For the one of those 4 years that they had some goal attainment, it was 0.5%. Most recently, the Washington State Department of Transportation was required to return funding to the Federal Highway Administration because they did not use support services funding. Support services funding comes with the DBE program to provide assistance to DBE firms in terms of marketing, technical assistance, bidding, whatever it might be.
Can I ask you a question? How much did they have to return?
In dollars, they returned $200,000. The actual loss to the Washington State DBE community is $519,000. FHWA, in a report back to WSDOT, identified $519,000 worth of funding that they had provided to WSDOT for support services funding that they had not expended in 2014 and 2015. It's important to note that during this period of time, DBE firms were going to WSDOT and requesting this type of assistance and report. And they were being told that there was no funding available for them to provide that assistance. So at a time that they were being told that there was no funds, the funds were there. Because they didn't utilize it, it had to be returned. The loss to the DBE community is more like about $700,000 because there was OJT funding provided along with the support services funding. They did not expend the OJT funding as well. I know I'm out of time. I'd be glad to.
If you have written testimony, you can give it to us too. I'd like to see copies of those disparity studies if you can get them to us.
Yes, I will provide you copies of all of the documents that I referenced.
Thank you, Mr. Armstead. I appreciate y'all's expert testimony and sitting here waiting and watching me go long on all of the other testimonies. So thank you for being patient with me and sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The second panel is going to address getting public construction dollars into the community through good jobs. So I'd like to invite Lee Nugent and Andra Kranzler. Lee is the Executive Secretary of the Washington State Building and Construction Trades Council. And Andra Kranzler is an attorney with Puget Sound Sage and Target Local Hire Coalition. So please, Brother Nugent.
Thank you, Senator. Members of the caucus that still here. We do appreciate you taking time on testimony. We also think at the Building Trades that the issues related to people of color do not get enough coverage and they're not being addressed enough. If you add in the idea that the issues that face people of color impact our budget in multiple ways, from corrections to education, something we can address, any way to change that. We're providing you a booklet today. It's a lot of information to try to get through in my 5 minutes. I'll be as quick as I can do as we walk through there. I encourage a follow-up meeting to address this issue more intently because it is very, very important, and I think the data is very revealing. The first chart that we had for you is the apprenticeship utilization for the Sound Transit projects. Sound Transit was selected at random as far as the data. What we're trying to show in that first chart is the idea that regardless of what your apprenticeship utilization rate is, that the contractors statistically are always 1 or 2 points under that utilization rate. Sound Transit, we have a variable rate, 20% on most of their projects, 15% on all their underground projects. That's due to the natures of the underground construction. It's more hazardous. But when you see it, the percentage of underutilization is the same, whether it's surface or underground. The second part of that we had handed out today on page 4 shows that the participation of people of color, that's through 2015, September 2015. The data is showing on actuality is that we are increased over our goal. The actual participation for people of color is dramatically more than the goal that was first set. But we also want to read between the lines on what that people of color participation rate actually means. If you go to the chart on page 5, and again, I'm breezing through this really quickly to save time, but I'd like to go through this more in depth when we do have time. If you look at the PLA goals results by Sound Transit Link, the same September 2015 data, if you break it out.
Can you define the acronyms for us as you go through?
Oh, Project Labor Agreement,
Yeah.
Project Labor Agreement for
you.
Sound Transit, also Community Workforce Agreements through the City of Seattle and others. But if you look at the demographics on the page 5 of our little handout, it shows you that the women inclusion numbers hovers around 7% as an average, which is dramatically well for the construction industry. If you take into perspective that nationally in construction, their women are represented at 2%. So we're running 3 times over that, and we still do not make our own state-imposed goal through my participation as chairman of the State Apprenticeship Council. What it is also important that Washington State, as a result of our efforts in all industries, including Boeing, aviation, maritime, and others, is 11% female participation by state. Number 2 in the United States is California at 6%. So we do a dramatically good job with the amount of women that we do have. We are always looking for more and more female participation. If you look at the red line there, that's people of color. That shows that we're doing dramatically more in the people of color number and statistic. But when you look at the apprenticeship, we're still underneath our goal, and we think that the people of color participation rate and the female participation rate could also dramatically increase if they made their actual goals of apprenticeship utilization. The important thing I want to talk to you today is found on your page 7. This is just a random diversity chart from Sound Transit, but what it does is, if you look at the first pie chart, you will notice that that is the numbers for journeyman people of color participation rates, or all people participation rates. You will notice that Hispanics are 11% of journey level work on project labor agreements, and the census data for 2014 in King County show that they're at 9.4%. We also see that the black participation rate is 7% for journey level workers, but 6.7% of the census rate. That wasn't surprising. What was surprising was this next part, and I'm going quickly as I can through here, is that the Hispanic percentage rate for apprentices and for blacks changes. So it goes from the 11% for Hispanic to the 9% for Hispanic in apprenticeship, and the goal for black apprenticeship, of African American apprenticeship, jumps to 11%, which is alarming when you think of the idea, where do all these journey level Hispanics come from, and why, the second part of that question, why are our black apprentice African American apprentices not progressing into journey level? We have come to the conclusion through a study through a number of years in the greater Seattle area as the executive secretary of the Seattle Building Trades and negotiating all their PLAs, that when you go into take the construction industry as a whole, open shop and union participation, you will not find African Americans in the non-union market at all. It is dominated by Hispanic youth, Hispanics on all the general construction, and is it exclusively white dominated in the licensed crafts. So we're looking at the data difference.
These are the non-union apprenticeship programs.
We're non-union period, not even with the apprenticeship program. It also leads into that people of color and that bigger argument about budgeting, one of that issues being wage theft amongst that non-union workforce, being exclusively predatory on documented and undocumented Hispanics. So it's a big issue there. But the key for us, the key for my testimony today, is that the use of project labor agreements, community workforce agreements, are inclusive for African Americans. The data here uses the term black throughout. But if we are addressing the idea that if the African American participation rate is minimal in the construction industry period, then we can look at our data and reflect that the participation rates by African American males are in the unions, are in the apprenticeship, but we need to get them to that next level of journey level. So that leads to more and more pre-apprenticeship training. The building trades identified this, so we are starting our own pre-apprenticeship to focus on African American male and women into our project labor agreement through our preferred entry components. That funding stream has never been very strong. We would encourage more funding into pre-apprenticeship so that we can continue to give a positive outlook, positive outcome to people that do not have it. I also want to bring to the attention that construction industry is the dominant hirer of people that have criminal backgrounds and other things. There are other challenges that they face from their education level, from their community level, and everything else. You will not see that same participation in maritime or aviation or any of the other industries. It's predominant in the building trades entity. So with the new City of Seattle priority hire agreement, we will be extending that apprenticeship utilization goal that we've always had. Now we will have a journey level goal, and as Frank had said earlier, I-200 devastated what we can do legally for journeymen on any project labor, public works. So what we're doing here is we're doing it by economic zone. So it's not by a race and it's not by a gender. It's by an economic zone. Everyone in that area is eligible for that employment. So that gets us around the I-200 question. But the second part of that, and the most important part of that, is it's not enough to get people into a pre-apprenticeship, into apprenticeship, and then let them flounder when they're in that first or second year in the journey level or third or fourth year apprentice. By having that targeted hire, priority hire by economic zone, we're impacting that apprentice throughout the lifetime of their apprenticeship until they can get the goals to be able to stand alone. So it's an important distinction, and that data reveals it, and we would like to follow up on that, but the conclusion is we need more pre-apprenticeship. We need to target it specifically for African American males and females, and that we need to do more for the community that does for us. I appreciate your time. Any questions I can avoid?
No, I'll give you one that you can't avoid. No.
Okay.
No, I appreciate, that's amazing interpretation of the data there. I appreciate seeing the data. And I'm curious about the non-union apprenticeship training program, why their numbers are so bad. I mean, it's because in the union we have joint apprenticeship training committees, which is the employer and the union involved in that industry. That doesn't exist in the non-union market. They don't have signatory employees the way we do. And so if you take the most successful apprenticeship program in the open shop, which is
CITC, their total number of apprentices overall is about the same as my trade union ironworkers have just for their craft. So it's a difference. When we're talking in that open market, we're not talking any apprenticeship hours whatsoever. It's just, where you get what you get.
But let's talk offline about
Please.
possible solutions. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, yes, please go ahead. I'm sorry, I'm delaying us.
No worries. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this work session conversation, and excited that our legislators are taking these issues to the next level. I wanted to just talk about how I come to the table. I'm a community economic development lawyer and planner, and community-led actions is kind of where I find my clients, right? Grassroots coalitions. In 2010, I worked with residents in White Center to talk about South Park Bridge and how they were dealing both with loss of infrastructure in terms of a vital road that got them out of South Park and into Seattle and Tukwila, and also economic disparities. Folks were really suffering from underemployment. What we learned was that there was a Federal Highway Administration funded project, and therefore we would only be able to see at maximum like 7.5 apprentices for the entire project. And there was no language around journey level workers that would be meaningful for anybody in desperate need of a job or career. In 2011, similar situation, but only it was in the heart of Seattle in 98118 zip code. Rainier Beach Community Center was going under construction, rehabilitated, and a really important amenity for residents in South Seattle. That project was getting a lot of attention by the media because of the City of Seattle's Women and Minority Business Enterprise Inclusion Plan. Meeting with workers, unemployed workers, underemployed workers of South Seattle, they had been meeting, and they were really struggling with worker getting jobs and thought that WIMBY meant something for them. What we later learned was that actually it was about the contractors, and it was about leveling the playing field for the contractors, and it didn't, again, have any meaningful language for workers. The priority hire legislation is exactly what Ms. Senite Brown spoke about earlier. It is a community-led initiative. Priority hire legislation was an opportunity for workers to talk about, hey, we're here, we want to go to work. How do we get to work, and how do we get career jobs? As Lee mentioned, many of people of color in 98118, or not 9118, but people of color, are able to access the construction industry in a way that they can't access other employment because many people have criminal history. I think it's 1 in every 3 African American men 18 to 24 have some involvement with the criminal justice system. We also have an aging in place construction industry. So again, workers in need, both on both ends, right? I need a job, or one person needs a job, and the industry needs workers. So how do we take this moment and do something? Priority hire was an opportunity to, again, champion the issues around workers. They wanted livable wage, healthcare, and pensions. Contractors, because we engaged contractors, laborers, apprentices, and apprenticeship training providers. Contractors wanted consistency. These one-off projects with social justice, equity provisions were very difficult to comply with when the rest of the industry isn't requiring that, right? So it's hard to change your norm, and it's hard to address your implicit or explicit bias if you only have to deal with it, once every 5 years. So what we sought to do was to try to build community power and rely on our coalition partners' expertise. We identified 3 types of workers that needed to be benefited from the priority hire legislation that was adopted by City of Seattle, and that was people of color and women in unions not regularly getting employed, disadvantaged workers, people of color, women not in union but with construction experience, and apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship opportunities. And I think that we are well on our way to seeing some success from both the priority hire legislation and a community workforce agreement that we had negotiated as a pilot project. I think these issues are local. In our community, we decided a project labor agreement was the best way to go because the residents really had experience with unions and thought that that was the pathway to careers, so we championed that. They also had a really broad base of apprentices. Now, not all the apprenticeship providers are actively complying or even bringing apprentices in or even having them perform on city-funded projects, and you can look at the Priority Hire Advisory Committee report that was released for November, and you can see that they're struggling with preferred entry and apprenticeship. So we really need to make sure that it's inclusive, that the language actually meets the needs of the community. The priority hire legislation is creating a regional dialogue that I hope will be seen across the state, and I think that the legislators can champion that. I'm disheartened to see that to hear about opportunities where funding is coming and there's not explicit language around helping those who are living in economic distress zones. Again, we fought for economic distress zones in zip codes because we wanted to make sure that it's not just about the individual who's struggling with under and unemployment, right? If they don't want to be in the construction industry, that's, they're not going to necessarily be the first benefactor. But if you live in that community and you can have a livable wage job, then you benefit. Then everyone kind of has this benefit. If we can promote local hire to some degree, then we start to talk about protecting our environment and reducing the number of folks driving 200, 300 miles on the road just to get to their job, and you really start to see the investment. And I think I'm done. Okay. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cronzler. Any questions for the panel? Thanks, and I apologize for keeping y'all so late. And we are at our final panel. Yay. So at this point, I would like to invite Ollie Rod of Rod Properties, David Fukuhara of Concourse Concessions, James Yu, owner of Ace Metal Company, and Luz Bazan. Luz, did you make it over today? Well, maybe Luz isn't here. She is the president and CEO of Rural Community Development Resources. And they are going to share some firsthand experiences as minority business enterprise owners. So, Mr. Rod, please go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you, Senator Hasegawa, for inviting me to speak to you today about the minority-owned small businesses. I have been living in Olympia area for the last 33 years. I have been in real estate business for the last 16 years. I have a successful partnership with the General Administration, now called Department of Enterprise Services, DAS. I value our working relationship with DAS, as well as the state agency in our building. It has been a great honor to provide space for public servants who are doing a great job for the citizens of the state. Starting a small business in the field of real estate investment has been tough, but rewarding. What was once a dream of owning one building on the corner of 10th of Columbia is now a reality, successful business with several buildings in the Olympia area, some went to the state and some into the private sector. Let me share with you my thoughts about challenges faces minority-owned businesses looking into working with the state of Washington. In this field of real estate investment, you are competing with a big corporation whose financial horsepower is exponentially higher than any small company. And that also reflects on the pricing. So when you're talking a project between $10 to $50 million, and you go to the bank and you get interest rate of 7%, and the big company get interest rate of 4%, 4.5%, that kills the project. That's a killer. So if the state still use a business model in which project will be awarded to the lowest bidder exclusively, what this will do is eliminate a lot of minority business, and only very few big investment companies will prevail. What this will do in this case is will entrap the state only to dealing with small companies, and they will name the prices at one point or another. There are a lot of factors when you are selecting a project in terms of leasing a new space or an old space. And I think the risk factor here to the state is when most of these projects go to a very few companies, okay? It applies like when you go to a loan, when a person go to a bank and ask for a loan, they say, okay, the maximum we can lend a borrower is X million of dollars. It is the same thing. The reason the bank do this, because they need to calculate the risk factor of this. If this guy fail, how much we have liability. The same thing with the state. They have giving a lot of projects to certain companies, and one of them in a few years failed, and the state agency were fighting to get the electricity not to turn off, or the utility bill was still not being paid, and they might not have water. And DES can attest to what I'm saying about it. So my thinking on this here is this: the state needs to look in a different model how to award these big projects. All these leases is millions of dollars. It's not like a small contract of $100,000 or $200,000. It's more than that. So the key here is a cultural change in the agency too. Whatever you put as a mechanism to help minorities, if you don't have the staffing where it can come from the top down to implement the changes, okay, then this will not gonna go anywhere. So training staff, whatever outcome, whatever solution you provide to the state agency to follow, needs to be followed with the training so staff can implement it. I used to work for ecology, and when Christine Gregoire was there, looked at the management team, they are 99% male, there's no female. In 4 years, she left 50% manager female, 50 are female. Change can happen in 4 years. So the question is how we implement it, how we proceed in doing this. So I want to be brief. We're already over time. I'm going to leave my time to the
Thank you,
gentleman.
Mr. Rod. Appreciate it. Mr. Fukuhara.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Senator Hasegawa and members of the members of Color Working Group. My name is David Fukuhara. I'm a native of Seattle, and I'm an owner of and managing partner of Concourse Concessions. Concourse is a minority-owned small business operating 3 food and beverage concession stores at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Concourse operates at SeaTac under a sublease to the HMS Host Company, which is the largest airport food and beverage operator in the country. Host operates at SeaTac under 2 large prime contract agreements with the Port of Seattle. In order for us to be considered for a subcontract under Host, we had to become DBE certified, so we went through that process with the OMWBE office, the state of Washington. And the reason for that is because the Port of Seattle gets federal funding, and the 49 CFR requires them to have DBE participation. Much of the talk has been about how to obtain contracts with government entities, but my case goes beyond obtaining the contracts, and it illustrates how disparities and discrimination can be institutionalized in the administration of these contracts. In 2004, the Port of Seattle reset the concession program at SeaTac Airport and awarded a number of new contracts and spaces. We were able to get 3 spaces under the HMS Host prime contract, and a number of other DBEs did too. And what happened is Host basically gave us all the worst locations. They kept the best locations. So obviously their whole portfolio became much more profitable because they're the worst locations we had to take on. We had to build out. And our build out costs were just as expensive, if not more than theirs. However, and the Port of Seattle approved this arrangement. And even when we tried to bring this up to them, they did nothing. The staff did nothing to address these disparities because we had some of the highest build-out costs because we were put at the outskirts of the airport. We had some of the lowest traffic and the lowest sales, so it was hard to recoup those build-out costs, of which after 12 years, some of us still have not been able to recoup our build-out costs. We are paying the highest rents of any of the concessionaires in the airport. You know, we're paying like 14 to 18%, while there are others in the lucrative high traffic central terminal there are paying 8 to 10%. Why? Those questions seem to go unanswered, but it does seem like the DBEs are paying a disproportionate share of the rents out there. So a group of the DBE businesses asked the port to address these disparities, and the port staff basically did not respond. We went to the Port Commission, and when the first African-American port commissioner in 100 years was elected, Rob Holland, he helped us to gain momentum, and the Port Commission passed a motion on a 5-0 vote to provide equity to the DBE concessionaires. Rob Holland left the commission, however, and that commitment was never followed through on. So the current commission and the port staff did not honor that commitment. To try to gain equity, a number of DBE contractors had to band together and file litigation. And I think that got their attention, but even more so with the help of community activists such as Eddie Rai, Toshiko Hasegawa, Bob Armstead, and a number of others who came down and spoke on our behalf. I think we started to really get their attention. And all of that has led to the fact that we're heading into mediation at this time. So, and I bring this up because in the next 2 years, the concession program at SeaTac Airport is going to be reset again. There will be probably 100 concession spaces that will be bid out at SeaTac Airport. And as if you read the latest Puget Sound Business Journal, SeaTac Airport is scheduled to be booming with traffic. And those who have the nice concession locations are going to benefit dramatically. I will say, though, the minority businesses have taken on a disproportionate burden there. We are the first ones to move to the $15 an hour across the board minimum wage for all of our employees. The large businesses such as HMS Host and Hudson News, they have not gone to the $15 an hour, as has many of the other larger businesses out at SeaTac Airport. We have followed every rule. We have paid every dime of rent, and we hire a large, from the top down, we hire minority employees. So anyways, as the Port of Seattle moves forward with their new concession program, it could dramatically benefit the minority business community, and anything you can do to keep an eye out to make sure that the playing field is level in accordance with federal law, we'd very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for that testimony. Representative Ryu has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Fukuhara, do you know if HMS Host needed the DME certified businesses to fill any kind of a quota or any kind of a obligation because of it being a federal project?
Yes. As part of their commitment to the Port of Seattle under their prime contract, they agreed to make an effort to subcontract. It was like 20, maybe 20% of their dollars out.
A follow-up, please.
Please go ahead.
So in that prime contract, is there any kind of a obligation that they needed to be fair to their subcontractors instead of just using you, I guess? Or I mean, obviously you wanted those contracts, but being in a landlord-tenant relationship is something that I'm really familiar with. As to who has the shaft of the sword is how Koreans describe it. So is there any kind of a obligation in that prime contract as to how fairly they must treat their subcontractors?
No, there's a good faith effort requirement that they should try to subcontract a certain percentage to DBE businesses. Who carries the sword is the Port of Seattle, because they're the ultimate customer. If the port tells host what they want, host will comply. And as we can see, that a new CEO came to the Port of Seattle 1 year ago. He's taken time to assess the situation, and he has taken some affirmative moves to address the situation. There were staff members who have been found to discriminate, and to his credit, he fired them. And he's also moved the concessions program under a different organization. So that gives us hope that under the new concession program that will be bid out within the next 2 years in 100 spaces, as I mentioned, that things will be done in accordance with a fair and level playing field.
Thank you. Mr. Yu,
Hi, how are you?
please, I'm sorry.
I'm the last one, huh? Okay.
Save the best for the last.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, member of the committee, and for my record, my name is James Yu. Believe me or not, I'm 75 years old, a businessman,
Yeah.
and having over 20 employees. And I was vice president of National Minority Association. Those two gentlemen previously occupied these two chairs, Armstead and Lamos. I know very well with them, worked with them in the past. Also, I know very well with the Chris Liu. And I have visited him many times, and he is a wonderful individual for working for on not the minority, but for small business. And I have been living in this country over 55 years. Graduated from 2 universities, and work as what you call busboys to the regional manager in big corporation. I have seen a lot of the bias, racial bias in 1960s. And today, you will see very subtle bias. So there is a bias there. How are you going to hide them and what do you call screw you, you know what I mean, that kind of situation. And as a member of a National Minority Association, I have worked very extensively with the Port of Seattle, which is the main major topic. I understand what kind of problem he went through. And also I work with the Sound Transit, King County, and the city of Seattle. Now, I'm coming here to testify you not as a minority business. I come here as a small businessman, okay? And you have to distinguish that. If you talk about small minority business and they talk about you are begging for the job, I'm not what you call come here on that level basis. I'm qualified, I have a capacity, I have a resource, I have a management expertise. However, I haven't found one meaningful job. Even I associate in the past with the National Association of the Minority, with the Sound Transit, nor City of Seattle, King County, and also Port of Seattle. I have maybe 2,000 meetings. If I go present small business point of view, they say they are not bounded by small, they are not exist for small business. They are working on, based on PLO. You know what that means? Previously, union men said labor, project labor agreements. Now, there's an institutional bias here. You have a PLO, and also, previously the speaker said the I-200. To some degree, the city of Seattle, they bypass the I-200 very creatively, try to reach out the small business people, okay? But Port of Seattle has not. Matter of fact, 2 months ago, Federal Department of Transportation official come to visit me personally, and they want to know about inner working of the Port of Seattle. So we had a nice, meaningful conversation with those guys. And always the Port of Seattle, they mentioned that they are not bounded by state statute, King County statute, and the city of Seattle. They are independent agencies, therefore they can do whatever they want to do it. Okay? Now, when they said, my argument is this. Listen, King County provide about $70 million of money to every year. I'm the resident of the King County. I like to have little portion of that, money King County contribute to Port of Seattle. And also I told them, Department of Transportation provide millions and millions of dollars. So let's have some business under federal guideline. So what the answer is, well, we are under study of the diversity, which proved to be, we know the outcome less than 1%, okay? And I told them, I follow all your license agreements, and the lottery system, you have to register, they call SES. Whenever they need a vendor, they go through a computer stimulation, they pick you up, right? And they ask you whether they want to do a business. After I have it registered, year and a half, I haven't got any calls. So I visited the Office of Social Responsibility. Hey, you came to our organization, enlist to register SES, and most of our members register, but they haven't got any call from them, okay? And, I gotta find out. And they haven't give a meaningful answer. Here's an institutional problem. I'm not trying to pick the Port of Seattle. You have the director, you have the Office of Social Responsibility, you have the commissioner. Commissioner make all the policies. And those Office of Social Responsibility, more or less, they are responsible to the wishes of the commissioner's office, okay? So.
Can I get you to speed it up, and we need to wrap up here pretty quick. So.
Okay, so there is institutional bias, which I mean is the operational managers, they don't listen. They have been there for many years. They like to do whatever they want to do it. And you have a Office of Social Responsibility, but they can have no enforcement power for them to dictate, you know what I mean? So one agency, the department like to do some business, the other, the old-timers, and they don't want to move themselves. So we have institutional problem there. Unless we have some kind of the educational program at the institute, or some kind of mandate imposed on, I don't think any the issue will be changed. He will have the same problem I have. I will have the same problem he had. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Yu. I think they sounds like they could use some leadership from the commission itself over the staff. So, any questions? Okay, thank you very much. We're going to move to public testimony, if anybody's left that wants to testify. So, just run down the top. I'll call names off. And Sam Merrill here? Brianna Rains? No. Frank Limos is gone. David Fukuhara. Oh, you're on here, but Dan Seidel. Come on forward. Bob Cooper is gone. Bob Armstead did already. James Hugh. Sean O'Sullivan. Are you planning on testifying? Okay. Cliff Cawthon. Cliff Cawthon here? No. Sarah Lipek. Not here. Nina Martinez already testified. Eddie Rye. Gonna testify? Mr. Seidel, it's all yours.
Well, good morning, Mr. Honorable Chair. Thank you very much for putting this together. My name, for the record, is Dan Seidel, and I am the CEO of the Entrepreneurial Institute of Washington. First, I would like to, because of the nature and the depth of the conversation that we've had today, I would love to be a part to participate on the continued conversation, and just appreciate the work that you're doing here. We've covered so much, and from my perspective, it's and my participation in the community, there's a lot of common threads. As an African American male, I heard a lot of common themes, and having a brother who's incarcerated right now, it really means a lot to hear that we're having this discussion. What I would like to see as a potential outcome from this great dialogue that we're having here is some solutions that are really truly based on collaborations. We've heard some very distinguished people from representing public agencies, labor, and the community. And now I'm aware of several millions of dollars that are coming to our region specifically for community capacity building. Some in the tools of workforce development, some tied to really changing the inequities as it relates to our criminal justice system, as well as providing introductions to our youth to get them engaged and start building capacity at a young age. I would just like to make a suggestion that there could be some opportunities where we could grow minority business, which could then create a trickle-down effect. And my suggestion is, as it relates to small businesses and labor, sometimes there are disparate views. And to me, I think there's opportunities for collaboration. And unfortunately, a lot of the open shop minority contractors and businesses, in order for them to really thrive with a relationship with labor, they really need to be doing about $2 million a year, maybe $5 million. And so those small businesses, those small diverse businesses that don't fit under that threshold, to me it seems to be that there could be a collaboration where we could introduce workforce development, whether we're doing it at the schools, we're doing it at programs, but to me it seems like there is a great opportunity for us to collaborate with our minority business organizations and capacity building programs, as well as with these great skill center, and develop some innovative practices around inclusion and introducing our kids to STEM careers. So in that, I would just like to close by thanking you very much for putting this on. I know it's late, so I will yield any other time for any questions you may have.
Any questions? Well, Thank you for your testimony. I want to apologize to everybody for not being more concise on the, I overbooked, obviously, our agenda. Thank you, Mr. Brown, Mr. Hall, for hanging there with us, and members of the committee, what's left of it. Thank you so much. And this meeting's adjourned.